Hello, everyone, and welcome to You Have a Game Idea, Now What? A wonderful creative panel with some great, wonderful guests that will be moderated by Sen-Fung Lim. So thank you all on behalf of Save Against Fear and the Bodhana Group for coming and joining us for this weekend and having such a wonderful time. And like I said, with that as promised, you will be able to find this content later on the Bodhana Group YouTube page. So please visit that in the future for all of the fine content that you may not have been able to be here for, and all of the wonderful things you're going to hear. So with that, I will leave you in the more than capable hands of everyone, and be well and enjoy the rest of the con, okay?
Thanks, Jack.
All right. Thank you all again.
Bye, Jack. Bye,
Jack. See you soon.
You got it. Be well, all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, everybody, we're going to get started as Jack says goodbye, and we'll start by saying hello, and I'll just, moderate this as normal. We'll go roundtable style, and if anybody in the chat has a question, you can ask it in the chat, and I will say it, or you can put your hand up and unmute and then ask it. Just wait for me to actually call on you to start talking, okay? On that note, let's get started. Let's get started with introductions. Eddie, why don't you tell us about yourself?
My name is Eddie Webb. I'm a full-time freelance writer and game designer through my company Pugsteady. One of my main clients is Onyx Path Publishing, where I serve as the in-house developer. So I help to not only develop games, but manage other developers and help them and give them the resources and support they need. And I've also created my own game world called The Realms of Pugmire at realmsofpugmire.com.
Excellent. Doug, how about you?
Thank you. I am Doug Levandowski. I'm a freelance game designer, leaning more into RPGs, but also still some board game tabletop stuff. Probably my biggest project is Kids on Bikes, Teens in Space, Kids on Brooms, that powered by universe. And that's just been a blast to work on, and I'm thrilled to be here with the greats on this panel.
Excellent. Cynthia, let's hear from you.
I'm Cynthia Celeste Miller. I'm president of Spectrum Games. Been in the industry for about 18 years. Oh, crap, there I went into
you said the number.
Why did you stop me? I have done such games as Cartoon Action Hour, Slasher Flick, Macabre Tales, Stories from the Grave, On the Air, and most recently Urban Manhunt. And that's it for me.
Excellent. Last but not least, let's hear from Luke Peterschmidt.
Hey, Luke Peterschmidt. I'm currently working at AEG on their management team, and I run their Kickstarters. Before that, I go all the way back to, I'll even date myself further, to 94. I came in with a collectible card game boom, and I'm probably best known for designing Bakugan, that little game with the pop open balls. But most of my work has been in the hobby space.
I still have Bakugan in my laundry room, by the way, because they magnetized into the drum. And so I would pull them out and stick them onto the top of the washing machine. And then when we got rid of our washing machine just a couple of weeks ago, it died during COVID. A great time for a washing machine to die, by the way.
Oh, no.
I found a bunch of Bakugan still stuck to the side. All popped open, of course, because the magnets had activated them, right? So
yeah.
Bakugan was quite a hit in my house as well. I love magnets, so there we go. And I'm Sen-Fung Lim. I use he, him pronouns. I'm a board game designer and a RPG writer as well. And I'll be moderating the panel for these wonderful people. So yeah, if you have any questions, just hit me up in the chat and we'll get them online, or you can say them yourselves, like I said. Okay, cool. So how are we going to start out this panel? I guess we had a question from the panelists themselves, do you want to discuss self-publishing or do you want to discuss pitching to a publisher? And so I think the consensus was, let's do both. Why not both? Because I think we have a lot of people here with experience on all sides of that. Pitching to publishers, self-publishing, being internal with a publisher, and then having to self-publish anyways or pitch outside, and all sorts of things. So we have also range from very, very small indie press all the way up to mass market. So we've got a lot of experience on this panel. So why don't we take it away with that? Let's start with, what do you guys think? Self-publishing? Does that sound okay?
Yeah,
sure. Okay. So where do we start with self-publishing? Who wants to to take this one first? Oh, did we lose Cynthia?
Oh no.
No,
Nope, there she is. Okay, so let's start with Doug. Doug had his hand up. Let's start with self-publishing. Because we have our idea already, now what happens?
Yeah, so I wanted to start because when I first got in, thought I'm going to be a self-publisher, and that way nobody can constrain my brilliance. And
then what happened?
And then I realized that many of my favorite bands had gotten into a situation where once they became big enough, they ditched their record label and then did whatever they wanted to do. Dredge is like my number one go-to example for that, for anybody who knows. And the quality just went down. Part of being a publisher is knowing what works and what doesn't work. Good publishers are going to give you good advice, which is almost a tautology, I think. But I think I didn't realize it first. And also that if you're in the self-publishing realm, you're doing a whole bunch of work that's not design work. And if you want to do that, cool, great. The world needs publishers, and there are many, many great publishers and designers. But I think you have to ask yourself, do I want to be in the business world or do I want to be in the design world? And for me, the design stuff is fun. The business stuff is terrible. And so for me, the first question that I would ask somebody who says, I want to self-publish is, do you want to be a publisher? Or do you just want to get your game out there and you're having trouble finding a home for it?
That's a really good question. So, I mean, we can ask that actually to all the attendees. If you want to put in the chat, what you'd rather be. Do you want to be a publisher? Do you want to be a designer? Some combo of both of them? And how many of the people in the actual attendance are have a game that they think is ready to go? That's a good question because it'll help us frame things for you. Okay, so on self-publishing, Luke.
Yeah, so I just want to say that there's another thing. If you have your idea already and you're trying to decide between self-publishing and pitching, the first sieve that I would put that idea through is how complex is the thing you're trying to do. There are games that are super clever that are super small. And those are great places to start for self-publishing. If you come out and you're like, I have this idea for a game like Gloomhaven, please don't self-publish. Find a publisher. Those products take a team of 6 people a year to make. And you will uncover all the ugly parts of what Doug was talking about how your job will turn from managing artist, not designing your game. So look at how complex your game is and have that influence your decision on where to go.
It's a really good point because most of the games like Gloomhaven, people don't see the work behind it. And people also don't recognize that Gloomhaven is like a 1 in a million chance of it succeeded despite itself, I think. So,
oh yeah, against the odds, yeah.
Yeah, and it could have actually sunk Isaac's career instead of launching it. So it's a really interesting case study of not what not to do, but you can't use it as a case study for anything that will happen to anybody. Cynthia, what about you? What do you think about self-publishing?
Well, I think that as has already been mentioned, you have to be prepared to wear a lot of hats, and you got to wear a lot of hats at once. And I think that's the trickiest part is you don't get to segment things like, well, today I'm going to do writing. I mean, you can try, but as soon as you do that, something's going to come along. You're going to have to take that hat off, put another hat on. But I think that it's ultimately very rewarding. I have been on both sides of the aisle, and I find that both have their advantages and disadvantages. But self-publishing to me has been the most rewarding. You do have pretty much total control, and that in and to itself is a big benefit to me because nobody can tell me, well, that idea is too niche. That idea is too, and that's what I was told originally on when I was trying to get into the industry with Cartoon Action Hour. I was told by a lot of people in and out of the industry, that's just not going to work. Nobody's going to want to play just 1980s action cartoons. That's too narrow. You need to broaden your focus. And I was told that. Eddie can vouch for that. I'm sure he remembers a lot of that feedback.
Oh yeah, I remember those conversations. Like, we should make it like a superhero game. We should make it more like something else.
Yeah. And then, of course, back at the time, this is early 2000s, we were getting the inevitable 400 messages a week. When, not if. When are you going to do a D20 version? And I was like, we're not. This is, he remembers with trauma. But so being able to be your own publisher, you can try to prove those people wrong or not. I mean, but you have that opportunity. So that's my thoughts on self-publishing.
Okay. And Eddie, what about you? You did Pugmire not through Onyx Paths, or right? So that was all you?
Well,
correct?
no, I did do it through Onyx Path.
Okay.
But it was creator owned, so there
Oh, I
was
see. how that works.
more of the middle ground, which I think is still worth kind of talking about, because to kind of both Doug and Luke's points, I didn't want to be the publisher. I didn't want to go through and hire the artists, or because I'm not a good art director, I didn't want to figure out the marketing campaign and what the budget was going to be for that. I didn't want to manage the Kickstarter. And so I reached out to Onyx Path and I was like, listen, I want to make this game, but it's not going to be an Onyx Path owned game. It's something that I'm going to have control over. I'm going to have the rights over. Luckily, Rich Thomas has been a good friend of mine for a long time, so I could have an honest conversation with him. But I pitched him the game and I pitched him the business plan at the same time. Because even though I didn't want to be in that publishing space, I still had to think like a self-publisher. I still had to think about what is this market going to be? What space am I moving into? I still had to have insight and a rough idea of what I want the art direction to look like. I didn't have to execute on it, but I still had to know all of that to make sure the game was in alignment with all of that. So even when you're still talking to a publisher, it doesn't obviate the need for all of this stuff. You still have to at least think about it and be able to intelligently have conversations in that space, because otherwise that will, to go to Gloomhaven, it's like how many other hundreds of complicated board games have completely failed in the Kickstarter space. And that was the one success. But I mean, Gloomhaven was extremely intelligently positioned and marketed. There was a lot of work on the back end, and people who have done that work. When I saw the Gloomhaven campaign, I was like, these people know what they're doing, because I could see that previous work was really paying off in that campaign. So even when you're someone like me, where I'm creator owned, but I'm closer to a full publisher, you still have to do a lot of that work and discussion.
Right.
It's worth noting on Gloomhaven, I think Isaac had like 12,000 posts on Board Game Geek before that Kickstarter came out.
Yeah.
So,
he had a community already.
Yeah, so you can talk about like it was just one person making a game, but it was one person doing marketing. Those 12,000 posts were customer service, which in most companies falls under marketing.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, and then the shipping was a real big thing too, because it was shipped for a very low price, which is very nice for the end user, but again, that could have sunk them entirely. So let's talk about the hats. Like, how many hats are we talking? Cynthia, you mentioned you have a lot of hats. You take them on, you put them off. What hats are we talking about? Is this like a sorting hat? Is this something else? What do we do? What do we have on our heads?
Right, the most obvious is, of course, the designer hat. And you've got, if you're doing your own designing, a lot of people go into self-publishing and bring in different writers, which I guess doesn't really become self-publishing, but I mean the model is still the same. Of course, there's, like Eddie mentioned, the art director hat. And you got to deal with the outsourcing hat, where you got to get editors and you got to get what have you. But and some people do the editing themselves whenever they do hire other writers. And so then, of course, there's the marketing hat, which is in some ways the toughest of the whole lot, honestly. And then, of course, the financial hat. You've got to look at finances and go, well, I can allot this many pages for this book based on what I think the sales are going to be right off the bat, and all that fun stuff. How much do I have for art budget? So you got to think about all that stuff all at once. And that can be overwhelming at times. It really can, even at a small level, because we're still a very small press. But even still, there are days when I just wake up going, oh shit.
Yeah, especially when you have lots of products, lots and lots of SKUs coming off and different orders and things like that. Doug, you said that you didn't want to do any of that, any of those other hats. You wanted one hat only. Which hat actually scares you the most, and why?
Great question. And I guess I should clarify and also self-promote for a moment. Like, I still do self-publish some things. Like, I have something on Kickstarter right now that's a PDF only, small thing. And that stuff I'm more comfortable with because it's the money hat that scares the ever-loving crap out of me, right? And the product in your basement hat. The first game I did with one of my best friends, and we printed it, and I'm proud of it as a first game. And I still have 30 copies sitting. I'm actually looking at them right now. And that part, the making the financial decisions of how much do we print, and then how do I get it out there? How do I market it as well? So I guess those two sort of go hand in hand. And so for something like a PDF only Kickstarter, that's easy, right? How much product will I have in my basement? The file on my computer, right? How will I manage my production costs? Well, what's my time worth? I'm a game designer, not that much. You know, what, and that's it, right? All I have to worry about is, will people buy this or not? Am I going to cover the costs of the art and the graphic design, which are things that I'm not able to do myself? So the money marketing hats, I would say, are the two that worry me the most.
And you make some great points about delivery models. So, you know, Drive-Thru RPG, itch.io, all these things make tabletop role-playing games really much more easy to jump into than the production that is required of like board gaming. And hey, there's Luke Peterschmidt. Let's talk to Luke about that. Luke,
Complexities.
yeah, tell me about the, like, so I know a lot of people at AEG, like I talk to Ryan and you know, Zinser all the time. You have this team that's actually separated by large distances. Like Todd was in China for a long time or something, wasn't he?
Oh yeah, and Nicholas is in Greece, and Vlad is in Guatemala. Like we've got.
It's ridiculous. How do you wear hats and still stay in contact with each other when you're so spread out? And do you ever switch hats? Do you like? Okay, tell us about like a bigger publishing than like Doug in his basement. Not that Doug in his basement isn't cool, but. No,
Doug Basement's super cool. That's like the most rewarding stuff, and you just make exactly what you want and use the modern tools to make it affordable and easy for you. I do want to mention real quick before, because Eddie brought up something that was reminding me. If you're coming from an outside and you're thinking about self-publishing, one of the toughest things to do is decide how much to make, which Doug said, and you're going to look at your product and think this is worth this number of dollars. But that's only when a company like AEG prints 50,000 of them at a very small price point. So sometimes your cost things can get really out of whack, and no company, the most dangerous thing even AEG will ever do is pick a print run. It is very challenging to pick how much to print. Okay, so how do we wear all the hats at AEG? Most of us at AEG have been in the industry for a pretty long time and done a lot of jobs. So I am very comfortable shifting from production to marketing to design to development. Those are all hats I've done in the past. And I think the international team we have is probably the most focused. They just do international. But it is beautiful for me now, after coming after lots of other jobs where I've been involved in lots of things, to really just be focused on the top line vision of the company with the other leadership members and how to do Kickstarters, which is something I've done. My first Kickstarter raised $65,000, and at the time was the 8th largest Kickstarter ever. That's how long I've been doing Kickstarters.
Right?
It was $65,000, and it was number 8 all time. Because I saw what you see, Doug. Like the idea of raising your money first and then making a product was just, how do you not do this?
It's like chef's kiss, right?
Yes. So I don't know if that really answers the question, but we do switch hats quite a bit, and we're all involved with game submissions. So
okay, that's really cool.
After the games get past like the first level of management, everyone in the company gets a chance to play and contribute, because we are all gamers. We're not ever going to hire a non-gamer, even for managing the warehouse. That's never going to be a non-gamer. Everyone in here will always be gamers.
Awesome.
That's really nice to know. Eddie, from your perspective, especially as somebody who works so intimately with the publisher on other projects, how is like ceding power or taking power and then giving power back and all that kind of stuff? How did that work with Pugmire?
It helps that, kind of like Luke was saying, I had done some of the other hats previously. My career before I became full-time freelance is I worked at CCP when it merged with White Wolf. And so I got to see all of the other sides of production. And a lot of those times I got to see those with Rich. So we already had built an established working relationship. And one of the things we talked about early on, though, was we signed a contract. We've been friends for a decade, but we still signed a contract saying, here are the rights. Here's what is explicitly in your wheelhouse. Here's what's in my wheelhouse. And here's stuff we're going to talk about. And from that, we actually formed it's written in a document. We actually have a creative committee, which he and I are both on. And so these are the specific topics that we will come to an agreement on. Initially, there was a lot of, I don't want to say arguments, but it was a lot of, we over talked about everything. It's like, okay, let's assume every part of the discussion we all need to be involved in. And after about a year of development, it was like, okay, Rich, do you really want me to see another round of how I'm hacking D&D 5 into the shape? And he's like, I just really don't care. He's like, cool, great. I'll just go ahead and take care of that now. And similarly, once we had, because he's been an art director for 30 years. And so after he's like going, hey, here's another sketch. And it's like, these are just all amazing. And I don't know what you want me to say. So just keep making dogs, please. Once we kind of recognized each other's strengths and got trust that we both saw the communal vision, we started to kind of then bifurcate a bit more. But we still constantly keep each other in check. And because it's only 2 people, it's really easy to get consensus. If it was a committee of like 8 or 9 people, that would be harder, and we probably have to have more delineated roles. But because it is just me and him at the end of the day, I could say, hey, I'm a little uncomfortable with how this cover's landing. He's like, okay, let's talk it through. Or like, vice versa, First Save versus Fear, we donated some copies of Pugmire, and he contacted me and was like, hey, let's make sure you're okay with this. It's like, of course, it's Jack. Yeah, let's give him some copies of Pugmire, But he still double checked with me. So it's that kind of respecting each other's strengths and allowing them to play their strengths, but also keeping each other in communication in the loop. And whenever there's any kind of doubts, double checking and say, okay, are we on the same page? Are we in alignment with this?
That is a really great point. So I'm a developer for a lot of other game companies, as well as a designer for many other game companies. And I find that, communication is the key to everything in this business, right? And what you're talking about is a couple of things about communications: establishing clear boundaries as to who's doing what and what approval needs to be, signed off on and what doesn't. Where do we have some creative freedom? Where don't we have any creative freedom? And then things like coming to consensus is really important, because I think people think that consensus means that everybody agrees, and it actually doesn't. It actually does not mean that at all. And so clear lines of communication, right? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, one point on consensus I think is valid is also we have delineated who gets to make final call, because you're right, sometimes you're not going to agree to it and say, okay, so in these cases, you can make the final call. In these cases, I make the final call. So, and that's another point of consensus. You're right, is like, okay, we're not going to agree. Somebody has to make the final decision.
Yeah, especially when there's 2 people, right? We can always have that even split, which is very hard to deal with.
Can I jump in real quick?
Yeah, go ahead.
You reminded me of a great story. So I'm at Wizards of the Coast, and John and Ryan both worked Wizards of the Coast this time. It's narrow time. And I just moved my family out, and I want my wife, Lynette, to meet John or Ryan, my new boss. And we're standing outside the office, and all we hear is them 2 screaming at each other, like at full volume through the door. And we're like, oh my, oh my. And then I hear this, is this a marketing decision or a sales decision? And I forget which the answer was. And then it was, okay, your way was what we're going to do, right? Because they had delineated those tasks.
Yep.
And then I walked in like, hello, is everything okay here? And they're laughing, they're having a good time, right? You also have to be able to like, let it go when you're not on the side that wins, and move on, because it's the product that matters. The product has to be as good as it can be. Right. So anyway, that was my greatest example. Just that story.
And honestly, that's why I don't publish. I don't like making decisions that impact other people's livelihoods. So it's like, yeah, I'm just going to sit over here in a little corner and design my geek stuff and be a total nerd. I'll hand that off, and you do with it whatever you want. And I'm very happy, because so lots of people ask me questions like, why would you give up 95% of the income? Because if you get like 5 to 10% as a residual, you're giving up 95 to 90% of the income. It's like, well, because I would actually have to pay other people to do that job anyways, because I'm no good at it, or I don't want it. And people don't see it as that. Sorry, Doug, go ahead. You had your hand up?
Yeah, and I was going to say that if I were doing stuff myself with something like Kids on Bikes, we would be making less than 10% of what we're making, right? Like that in addition to not having to worry about the stuff, there are people who are way, way, way better at doing this than I would ever be, right? And that's just a decision that I made as part of the community where I want to fall in there. Like you were saying, I want to go and do my geek stuff, and yeah.
And it's funny, if you've ever seen that Far Side comic where it's the guy with this, he's got a really small head and he says, "My head is full, can I please be excused?" That's literally me. Like every time I'm with all the other publishers and stuff, and like the art director and the graphic designer and stuff, it's like my head is already full of all like D6s equal this, and I have to make a table about that, and I've got to write some fluff on that. I don't have the headspace for the rest of the stuff. We actually have a great question from the chat, which is, when it comes to game design, what are the skills you need? Graham is saying that he's coming at this more or less blind and needs to know what to work on. So I'm going to ask Graham. Graham, if you want to actually unmute and let us know perhaps what type of game you're making and what your hopes and dreams are for the final product, we can guide you a little bit better. Go ahead.
Those are very important things to know. Absolutely.
I apologize if you can hear the children screaming in the background.
That's okay.
It's okay.
So I'm making this one for my master's degree. I'm a teacher, and I want to make a game that simulates surviving being bullied. Bullying is such a mechanical process, right? I mean, it has well-recognized paths that it follows. There are well-recognized things you can do to, not to resist, but to get through it, right? So I want to make a board game that lets people just walk through those things and experience all the failure modes and the things you can do to help. I want to make it strategic. And I'm shooting for like a non-horrible educational game, which is a little tough.
All right,
Let me
so
see.
that's a good start. And what do you hope to do for publishing, Graham? Would you hope to publish it yourself? Did you want to take it to a publisher? Is it something that would be, freely distributed to other teachers?
Well, that'd be, so ideally, right, like in my dream world, I would love to sell it to other teachers. I don't think I would ever self-publish because I wear too many hats already. Teacher, dad, designer. I don't think I could do one more.
Right. So, I mean, Teachers Pay Teachers would be a really good way to do something like that. I see a bunch of people with teachers in their families or are teachers themselves nodding. It's like, yeah, Teachers Pay Teachers could be a really good way to do something where that's the delivery model. And so you'd probably still have to do something with like layout of the game and maybe, print and play files if it's more of a board game style thing. But yeah, let's open it up to the panel and say, for Graham, what skills does he really need to kind of hone right now to get his product where he needs to get it? Cynthia?
Organization. I had a real problem. I am not by nature an organized person. I had to learn that skill set the hard way, like trial and error.
Yeah, you hired me for a while to do that.
Right. Anyways, and honestly, I have Barak and Norbert that help me do that now. So I still struggle with it, but it is a skill you have to learn if you don't already have it. But I think it's very important to the success or failure of any creative endeavor, least of all game design or publishing.
Luke?
Yeah, what Cynthia said. So organization is important, and it's important because you're going to have to go through lots of versions of your game as you learn, and you need to keep track of all that so you know where you came from and where you're moving to. Patience is important. Your first game try is not going to work. Like, I'm one of those bad game designers who spends way too long making my first prototype, and then I throw the whole thing away after like one round of play. I know I shouldn't do that, but I do anyway. That's my bad process, so don't do that. I think also you need to understand your target market. So if you're going to go through Teachers Pay Teachers, which if you don't know, it's just a website where teachers can download lesson plans, look at the kind of stuff that's on there and then design your game to be deliverable in that format. which means you can count on your audience having scissors and laminators and craft supplies and be good with them. I don't know about you guys, the folks designing, but for me, a third of my days when I design are like kindergarten in my office. I'm cutting things out of paper. I got my straight edge out. But you're lucky in that way that you know your audience, if you do teachers pay teachers, will have those skills. Yes, literally right here. It's just, yeah.
That's
and
one
then,
of the reasons I want to make it a board game and not a role game.
And lastly, I would say is observation. It sounds like you've looked into what makes bullying. The next step you're going to need to do is observe the people that get through it the best and the worst, and try to figure out what that difference is before you try to represent that with a game mechanic of some type. Yeah, so that would be my suggestions.
Doug, do we get anything from you?
Thank you.
Doug, you're muted.
No, I just realized. Yeah, I think along the lines of observation, playtesting is going to be key, right? Especially if you're coming to this as a first-time designer. Playtesting is a hard thing to get the hang of, and taking the ego out of getting feedback on things. I think getting really comfortable with how mechanics interact with each other in the game, especially in a game about bullying safety mechanics. I think the safety elements built into that game would need to be pretty airtight for that to be a safe game for people to play. And then graphic design and things like that. I mean, I'm concerned though, even that, not to get too into the weeds, but that even as a board game, triggering events would still be triggering events. Even if it's a card that says this thing happens, then that could still be a moment of crisis for a person. So I would say, even in a board game, even if you think it's as abstracted as possible, even if you endured and overcame bullying yourself, other people's reactions might be incredibly different. And so making sure that there are ways for people to tap out or ease off or whatever as they're playing would be essential.
Great. Eddie, do you have any points to add?
Really, just to kind of build off of Doug's point is one thing you could do to kind of figure that out pretty quickly is definitely don't do what Luke does, but instead do kind of find your core gameplay loop, to steal from the video game space. Find the one thing the players will be doing constantly and refine that. If you have concerns about, is this going to cause trauma or tap into triggering events, doing that in a very simple prototype to see if that core gameplay is fun. And if that is fun, then you can expand out. So like, don't think you have to make the whole game and have all the rules out and ready to go. You know, just like, okay, is the dice rolling and interaction and the moving around the board or whatever, is that all inherently fun? Does that work? And is that giving the right experience across? And then once you get that nailed down, then you can put in the complexity and the nuance and the texturing and the flavoring and all of that, and get that core, is that core gameplay fun? So like if this were, say, a D&D clone, it's okay, is D&D ultimately is about going into dungeons, fighting or talking to monsters and taking a treasure. So, you know, do a combat encounter, play through that. Is that fun? Is that interesting? Is that compelling? Cool. Now let's add another class to that. Let's add 6 classes to that. Let's add more powers to that, more monsters to that. But get that core, you know, basic fighter, basic monster, dice rolling. Is that working? Is that fun?
Absolutely, I would agree with that also. When I was doing Slasher Flick, which is like the exact opposite of an anti-bullying game, because essentially a slasher is a bully with a knife. So take that for what it is. But I actually studied, and I was already super well versed in slasher movies. That's my favorite genre of any movie ever. But I took notes, and I kept my eye on the prize. I asked myself, what is the attraction of slasher movies? And I made sure that aspect, which is the kill scene, I made sure that the kill scene mechanics themselves worked before I added anything else. That was the core aspect of the game. That was what the slasher movies are about. I stuck to that. And then once that was where I wanted it, then I was able to move outward into the rest of the design.
Yeah, it's a really good point. that core experience, you really need to, and I don't mean like the thematic experience. I mean like the visceral, emotional experience that the player is going through has to be, connected by the thematics and the mechanics. It's really got to resonate. But resonance is an issue with trauma, so just be aware of that. Some notes that I wrote down while you are talking so much stuff. Something I do when I'm designing games for empathy or for designing games therapeutically is I don't let anybody play the bad guy. Like, this is not going to be a thing that a student would play the bully, right? Or maybe even the teacher wouldn't play the bully. Maybe everybody else. Because if you look at, if you've studied the circle of bullying, like Oleus stuff, then you know that the bully's just one person in this big circle of like 6 or 7 other roles, and everybody else can play those other roles. Nobody has to be the bully. The other thing that I like talking about with teachers, especially because we didn't actually say anything, but there's a bunch of teachers on the panel. I'm one of them. And as a teacher, if you're going to make a game that I want to play in the classroom, this is what I need, like hands down, understand that I need a lesson plan from you to tell me what's next. How does this tie to my learning objectives, my outcomes? How does this lead to other things? Where does this springboard off to in terms of what's some stuff the students can go research, what's some stuff I can research as a teacher if I don't know anything about this? And games are a great way to engage people in the class, but it has to go somewhere else because most games, we might not even finish it in a class period, right? So we have to have something to go off of, and a lesson plan is a really good way to actually bring everything back to the idea of bullying and then expand it out. And for a master's level project, I think if you made a lesson plan, that would be super awesome to show your thesis advisors like, hey, I'm thinking past just the box, right? Eddie, you have a point?
Honestly, what you just described to me is a game design document, really, which is that this is the core experience we get across. And it's something that a lot of novice game designers, I think, don't do, is they just keep, it's very common when you're starting out in game design to throw more rules at a problem. It's like, oh, this problem's not work, so I'll add another rule, and I'll add another rule, and I'll add another rule. And then eventually the game starts growing into this kludge of rules. But if you have a game design document, you can constantly go back and say, is this addition reinforcing what I need this game to do? Like you said, that lesson plan. And it's like, okay, this is not actually inherently, to use the example, this isn't inherently addressing the concept of bullying. So why am I have this extra rule here? Let's toss it out. And it allows you to really focus that design more effectively. So yeah, that is a fantastic thing to have and a good thing to do when you iterate on stuff.
Luke?
Yeah, so you might find, and you have a great point, that the audience might not be a classroom teacher. It might be a school psychologist. Mm-hmm. In which case, they would have a much greater handle because they're probably doing this one-on-one with the students' stress responses. So you might want to talk to one of those folks to make sure you're designing the game, for the people you want. Earlier, Eddie mentioned the core design loop. If you don't know that term, it's basically what you do during a turn of the game. And for you, making a game about bullying, you want it to focus on the part where in real life, kids make the decision on how the bully will end up affecting them long term. It's the pressure point where you have a choice. Core game design loops always have a choice in them somewhere. What do I do at this moment? And I think that's a pretty obvious place with the bullying concept, which is, I think it's a great idea, by the way. No one said that yet.
Oh yeah, it's wonderful. Yeah. I want to see that. I teach a whole. So I teach. I'm a professor of psychology, so I teach people who are going off to be actually educational assistants. That's the program I work in, and I would love to see a game about bullying, especially if you built in things about people with disabilities. Would be wonderful for my specific needs. So do that, and I'll buy a copy. At least one will sell. There you go. So that was actually really productive. That's the expansion. Thanks, Graham. Just for Graham to tell us his goals, his issues. So if anybody else would like to share with us what they'd like to do, we've got about 20 more minutes, and we'd love to answer your questions and help you out in any way, shape, or form. Does somebody maybe have an RPG that they're going on, trying to make? That'd be fine too, because we have experts here. Eddie, go ahead.
I want to mention that there is a question in the Q&A panel.
Oh, thank you. I didn't see it.
No problem.
Oh, the question from Tanel is, what do you need to pitch an idea to a publisher? Oh, this is a very good question. And it can differ between RPGs and board games, but let's get to it. Who wants to answer that first? I'm going to throw this one to Luke because he's actually probably seen a lot of pitches or heard of a lot of pitches from the AEG side. So go ahead, Luke.
Yeah, so you need a working prototype. You need, and that can be at any level of development. It can look amazing, or it can look like just the numbers on cards, as long as the mechanic can be shown well. The better it looks, the more serious you'll be taken. But if your game is just clever with very simple looking components, that's fine too. And then you need a thing called a sell sheet. And if you look online, you can find them. A sell sheet will have the name of your game, ideally a picture of you in case you meet them in person so they can remember you, your contact information, key elements about the game, how long it takes, target market, theme, etc. And then if that's the kind of structure of game that company is looking for, they might call you back and ask for a demo. And right now in 2020, that demo is probably going to be on Tabletop Simulator. So teach yourself that skill. It's a pretty easy platform to use, but we are getting a lot of submissions through Tabletop Simulator. Once the world gets back to normal, I would suggest you go to a convention if you can, that a publisher you know is going to be at, meet them at their booth or arrange beforehand to pitch them your game. I know we have a person at AEG who does nothing but game pitches at Gen Con, and he sees 140, 150 at Gen Con. That's Ryan, so that's all he does. But yeah, working prototype is the key and a way to show it off.
Right. So I put a bunch of the apps that we use constantly in the chat. So Tabletop Simulator is a Steam-based product. Tabletopia is browser-based. Screentop TG is browser-based. And that's for specifically card and board. For role-playing games, we use things like, well, Roll20 or Discord or Roll or things like that. So there's lots of easier ways to do that for RPGs in some ways.
Yeah, I have a quick question for the role-playing folks there. I get the impression, because we don't do role-playing games, that most role-playing companies are designed to publish their own games. Do you guys take a lot of submissions with the companies that you work for?
Onyx Path has started doing that actually a couple of years ago. After I kind of kicked the door down and said, "Hey, we're making a game about dogs," and Rich is like, "Maybe we should look at other people's game ideas too." And I'm like, "No, just dogs, nothing else." But one of the things that came up was like, okay, but what does a pitch process look like? And one of the things I realized pretty quickly was that we don't have the bandwidth to read a 300-page manuscript and figure out if this is a game we want or not. So our pitch process ultimately is, I need you to tell me what's cool about your game in 3 pages or less. And if you can't do that, I can't sell your game. But also it allows to do things like, okay, it's going to be a game about, whatever. The mechanics still have at a high level. Because one thing I have learned looking at a lot of other, not only pitches, but also pitching myself and looking at blind submissions for writers and whatnot, is that I don't care so much about the details of the mechanics off the bat. It's what the average person picking up the game thinks those mechanics are going to be. If you say this game is powered by the apocalypse versus this is OGL, even if the rest of the pitch is identical, that sets 2 different tones and may decide whether it's something we want to sell or not. It's like 5e market is a very specific market you want to break into. And just by saying this is going to be a 5e based game, that gives us a whole bunch of factors we need to take into consideration. Whereas Powered by the Apocalypse is a different market that you have to break into and have a strong community. So I find that the best pitches, the ones we actually start moving on, are ones that have a little bit of a business plan associated with them. Not a detailed one, but just like, okay, this is the market we're thinking about. This is the kinds of people we expect to pick up the game. This is the core experience that people should expect when they sit down around the table. And this is a rough, high-level idea of what the mechanics look like if they're not based off of an existing system. And that usually gives us a good chance of a thumbs up, thumbs down. And there's been some fantastic pitches that we've turned down because they're just not our market. But we've also said, this is a good pitch. We're just not the company for you. It's not that it's a bad game. But a lot of people get really wrapped up in the world side of it. They want to tell us this is how this world's amazing. And it's like, cool, I don't want to read your novel pitch. I want to read why this is a gameable concept. Why what is a person around the table going to actually do in a 4-hour session of your game? Tell me that.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Go ahead.
Oh, go ahead. Sorry. Elevator pitches are super important in that regard. If you can tell me what's cool about your game, what's going to sell about the game within just a few sentences, then I'll look at it more seriously. And you have to know, as Eddie suggested, you have to kind of know what company to go for and what not to. With Spectrum Games, we're known for genre emulation. So obviously, if we get something that's out of that realm, we're not going to look at it as much or consider it because that's not in our wheelhouse.
Yeah, definitely do your research if you're pitching to companies. Look at what they've published in the past and present stuff like that at first. But then maybe some other stuff might hit because they might be moving in other directions, and that's okay too. Yeah, one thing I was going to say is this is very much like screenwriting. In screenwriting, we write like treatments. They're called treatment documents, and it's like 5 pages. That's like the first act, and it's not even the first act. It's like just a little bit here, and then all the characters, like the list of characters and kind of like their motivations and their relationships to each other. That's all you write for a treatment document. You don't hand over a full script unless they ask for it. So for pitching RPGs, what we've done a lot is we've done actually slide decks. So we do like maybe 5 to 10 slides at the most that sort of do exactly what Eddie was saying. We go over what's our vision for this, what's the main mechanic or mechanism, what's the, thematic resonance, what's the experience we think people will have while they're playing this, what's the feelings that this game is supposed to evoke. And there's not a lot about, there's a little bit about lore, because lore is important in RPGs. There's a little bit about mechanics, because mechanics are somewhat less important in RPGs, but still important. But a lot of it is more about, do we know what this product is going to look like? And if we can get that across to a publisher, they're much more likely to pick up that ball and roll with it, right? So I'll just give an example of a pitch we had where we said, oh, this is a game where you play as band members coming back after, a high school reunion after you've been apart for 25 years, and you're like hand making a poster. And that was our pitch. And the person who we're pitching to is like, yes, I've seen DIY punk rock posters all over my city. I get exactly what you're going for. Let's start working on this, right? So it's just hooking somebody. That's all a pitch really is getting your hooks into their brain and having them ask more questions, like want to know more about it. Not because you didn't tell them enough, but because you told them just enough to plant a seed in their brain. Like, I can't stop thinking about that poster making rock and roll game you talked about, Sen. We need to work on that because it's infected my brain, right? Is what you want to do with them. Doug, do you have anything about pitching on both ends? Because you do both, right? So board games and RPGs.
Yeah. So my full caveat here is I'm terrible at pitching games. Sen seen me try. So for Kids on Bikes, John did all of the pitching. But one of the key things is building off of what everybody said before, accurately conveying through a description what the game is going to feel like, rather than, I'm sorry, I thought I silenced my phone. The accurately conveying what the game is going to feel like as they're playing without saying they're going to feel this, right? So the game that's sort of front and center for me is a game that Cleo Yunsu Davis and I are working on. That's a quiet year hack where you're surviving a night in a haunted house, illustrating the house as you explore through it, and using a deck of cards that at different phases of the night has modular elements. So if you want to play a game about aliens, you shuffle that in. If you want to play a game about childhood trauma coming back to haunt you, you shuffle that in. Right? I haven't said you're going to feel this, you're going to feel that, but from that, that elevator pitch makes it clear that you could feel different things, that some of them are going to feel really bad and some of them are going to feel really goofy. Thanks, Sen.
I really do. Quiet Year is amazing, and
yes.
Houses are amazing, and you and Cleo are amazing. So that game is going to kick ass. I know it.
Thank you.
I called it right now.
Love to run it for you anytime. So that feeling has to come across in the pitch, because it's, especially in role-playing games, it's the feeling that sells, right? We were talking about the core loop before. even bigger than that in role-playing games is what is the overall thing going to feel, and then knowing that as you're working on the core loop is its own thing. But for pitches, compact, and for RPGs, feeling based.
Excellent. Do we have any more questions from the audience? Because we've got about 10 minutes left, I think. Let us know. If not, we can fill that time with like anecdotes and stories. Does anybody have stories about like successful pitches, unsuccessful pitches? What do you got? What do you got? Luke has something. I can see.
Oh, yeah. I could tell stories for way too long. My favorite pitch I ever received was Wizard of the Coast, and we were doing a game on WCW wrestling, I think. And Mike Fitzgerald came in and pitched us, and Mike comes from radio. And you know,
did he cut promo for you?
What's that?
Did he cut promo?
Woo!
He hit you with a chair.
Yeah, that's even better.
He basically, I mean, at Wizard of the Coast, they were pretty mundane affairs. You'd come in, you'd sit down with your playtest cards, and that was before that it was easy to make good-looking prototypes. But he comes in with action figures and music and comes running into the room and, let's do this! And I was like, what is even happening here? And, you know, I don't know if it was the pitch. The game was good, but we published that game. So got a Wizard of the Coast published game out of us by, I mean, he just went all in. He let us know that he did his research on the intellectual property. And that it was just fun. And Mike's like a great human being if you've never.
Yes, he is. He's wonderful. I will have to ask him to reenact that for me sometime when I see him next. That's great. Any other good pitching stories that we have? Even like pitfalls. I'll give a pitfall. So one thing, and this goes to what Doug said about, you know, selling the exact experience you want. We pitched a game to a publisher that was this card game, and it was a card game about juggling, and on the cards there were like, you know, swords and kittens and chainsaws that you were juggling. And the publisher thought, oh, this is going to be a really fun, quirky, silly game. Like, and it totally wasn't. It was a partner game where it was really strategic. Like, it was basically our homage to Tishu. If you've ever played Tishu, I love Tishu. It's a 4 to 6 player partner game, really. And I love partner games. But then the publisher said, like, 1 minute in, he's like, no, this is a pass. Because what happened was we sold them on an experience that didn't come through in gameplay. And that was like a big, but amazingly enough, we said, Jay and I sat down later and said, well, what can we do with this game if it's not what it is? And we made Junkard out of it, which is really weird because Junkard is a dexterity game. And that game has sold, you know, multiple thousands of copies. So out of failure can come success is all I have to tell you.
We do have a question in chat now.
Yeah. Is it legitimate to describe your game in terms of other games in a pitch? Oh. Luke, go ahead.
Yes. So, yes, 100%. As long as you don't follow it with the thing or start over with the thing I fixed about Magic the Gathering is this.
Yeah.
So many pitches come in and say, you know, I like Dominion, but what was always wrong with it is this, and I fixed it. Finding out what's wrong with a game that's a huge success means you missed the point. It was a huge success. What they don't want the Dominion that's different than Dominion in the way you want it, right? But if you say, look, you know, we just finished Kickstarter for one of Mike Elliott's games, and it was it's Thunderstone Quest, and he pitched it as it's Dominion meets Dungeons and Dragons. Great. You mentioned 2 great games. You didn't say I fixed what's wrong with D&D. That'd be dumb. So yes, totally okay, because it communicates what the game feeling it should be, which is what you were just talking about your screenplays. Like that, the movie industry is built around this idea of it's blank, blank, and it's not. That doesn't cheapen your product. It just communicates it better. Using loaded words that have meaning to the viewer already is totally okay.
Like honestly, all of my games can be boiled down to it's blank plus blank but blank. Like Pugmire is Lord of the Rings meets Planet of the Apes but with dogs. Dystopia Rising is Night of the Walking Dead meets Mad Max but with feelings. I mean, you know, it's that, and that one sentence gets so much across, especially if you say if you're leveraging well-known properties or well-known games, and people go, oh, I like that game. This sounds like a thing I might be interested in too.
I like the but with that you're saying, because that twist is really what sells me. Right? The 2 properties, it's okay. But the but, it's like, oh, now I'm interested. Now you've hooked me. Now I want to know more.
Right. But to Luke's point, make sure that but isn't, but I fixed it, you know?
Right. I do find that, a lot of novice designers will say, you know, and what was wrong with Monopoly is there's just not enough jails. So I added two more jails. That makes it such a better game. So I have heard from other publishers that they actually don't like having the comparison. And the reason why is probably because most people use it in the way that Luke described, but also they kind of want to find out what's cool about it. And they actually might not like the games that you're comparing it to. So that may be shooting yourself in a foot. The foot's your foot, a foot. So I like doing it where I let them find out about it themselves. So they actually ask me, so you mean like Scrabble plus Sushi Go? It's like, yes, exactly. And to be honest, I have sold games where I just walked up to a friend who's a publisher. I said, hey, Scrabble plus Sushi Go. And she's like, yes, I'm signing that now. And it's like, okay, done. We're done. But if I didn't know that person and know that she liked Scrabble and Sushi Go, that could have been potentially problematic, right? So also, I think hyperbole is bad. Like saying your game is the first game that ever did this. Yes. I can likely prove you wrong in 5 minutes of Googling. Why? Because I've been in the industry for 15 times longer than you've been in the industry, right? Not as long as Luke's been in the industry, but for a long, long time. And I probably have played that game that you're talking about that you think your game is the first of. Also, the best game that does this is really... it's hard to prove that, right? Buzzwords, industry buzzwords, we use them all the time, unfortunately. But in a pitch, I'd like you to actually communicate to me in like human terms, not buzzwords.
If you say the word ludonarrative, I'm stopped listening to you.
Ludonarrative, the ludonarrative about this game, yeah, I use it all the time. Yeah, Cynthia, go ahead.
Also, I'd like to add, whatever you do not, if you're making any sort of a game, do not take, like, if I see this a lot with fantasy games, we don't have classes and levels. Okay, well, a lot of games don't, and that makes you look like you have only ever experienced D&D when you do that. And even if that is the case, try to avoid looking like that's the case. Don't try to make something sound more unique when it's something that pretty much every game has. And a lot of that comes down to a little bit of market research, honestly.
Definitely. Doug, do you have anything to share?
Yeah, in terms of pitches, I put something in the chat about this, but one of the games I have coming out, the one sentence, like, short escalator pitch is it's love letter for 2 players, but there's light customizability between rounds. And he says with someone from AEG in the room.
No, it's a great pitch because I know love letter. Right.
Right.
So I know what customization is. You've communicated a ton of information with them, which is awesome.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
Eddie, anything to add?
I mentioned this in the chat too, but well, we're talking about bad pitches, and there's one game floating around I'm not going to name, but the marketing campaign it's better than D&D. That's the entire marketing campaign. And like goes to the larger points is like it just checks every box as to what you should do wrong. But I mean, because like Zook said, D&D is the most popular, one of the best-selling games on the market right now. That tells me nothing. I've learned that you think you're better than the best-selling game in the market, but what is the game? So take out, not even hyperbole, because sometimes you gotta sell yourself a bit, but take out qualifiers or implications of quality when you're pitching it. And also just, I think I craft my pitch before I start designing, honestly, because that goes back to, is my game still living up to this pitch in my head? And sometimes I'll adjust the pitch as I make the game. Say, I actually find there's a better space here. Let me adjust the pitch. But again, that's that one sentence design goal. I find it really helps me to focus it, because it's like, again, with Pugmire, it was, am I still getting that Lord of the Rings experience? Am I still getting, that Planet of the Apes experience? And, our dog's still involved. And when I did a cat version of the game, I actually had a different pitch for that game because I wanted a different tone. So Monarchies of Mao is a slightly different flavor than that. And even though I didn't tell people these have different tones, when people start playing them, they start playing with the mechanics, start looking at design decisions, they go, oh, actually, there's a slightly darker, more political tone to this cat game versus the Pugmire dog game. And people were finding that about me. I didn't necessarily tell them, play this game with more intrigue. So if you think of the pitch not as a way to sell the game, but as what the core of what the game is, and start building with that in mind, then a pitch is going to be very natural. You're not trying to sell the game. You're simply just explaining the game.
Yeah, I teach a class at Harrisburg University, and what I usually have my students do is try to tell their friend who's never played their game why they should want to come to their house and play their game. And they give them 4 sentences. And I'm like, here's your 4 sentences. And I make them pick games that everybody knows. So I say, okay, well, Call of Duty. Here's Call of Duty. How do you get your friends to come over to play Call of Duty? Well, it's first-person shooter. It's set in World War II. It's got a really big cinematic feel to it. I'm like, great, that's a pitch, right? That's essentially what you've done there. And they always start like a whole page, and I get them down to like 4 sentences at the end by using words that are preloaded, like it's a first-person shooter. That's preloaded doesn't mean it's got a bad connotation. It just means it's got a bunch of meaning. I actually did
Information
pre-COVID beard a series of videos on how to pitch to publishers and things. Not to say that I'm going to put in chat if that's all right.
Yeah, for sure. Go right ahead.
And you can check those out. Those are a couple years ago, but most of the information is still relevant. The second one is probably the most important video in that series. It's things you should never say. And that's we've covered a lot of them here. Like never say my game is better than this game, right? And the first one, the video there has a lot of things about the process of pitching and the things people do wrong that are small, that are just saying thank you, following up with an email. Like there's a bunch of stuff that in our digital world, we've lost a little bit of interpersonal communication skills.
Sure.
And so when you actually get to pitch a game in person, being personable is relevant.
Yes. I think you're exactly right. Like I actually don't necessarily pitch my game to people. I actually pitch myself, which is a weird way to look at it. But I'm super professional, right? That's what I want to get across. No matter what you think of this game, you will want to see my next pitch. Because this game might not be for you, but my next game will definitely be for you, or the game after that. And I want you to know that no matter what you think of my games, you think I'm a good person to want to work with in some way, shape, or form, whether it's as a designer or as a developer or whatever else I might be able to offer you. So learning how to pitch, yourself isn't in saying, I'm great and I'm this and I'm that, I have these skills. It's literally being professional. And I think Luke's points about, following up on emails goes both ways, because sometimes publishers aren't great at that either, right? And we give publishers a lot of leeway because they're busy people, but so are we. So we got to kind of, hold them up to some standards. Last question here, because we've got about 15 minutes before we really get kicked out. So this is going to be the last question because Jack gets mad. We don't want to mad Jack. How do you know if your idea is a good enough idea for the market? Eddie, go ahead.
The kind of short answer is you don't. If you make your game the idea of chasing a market trend, you're already too late. So don't try to do that. Like, vampires are hot right now. By the time your vampire game gets done out in the market, vampires will no longer be hot. Maybe vampires is a bad example because they go in waves and cycles, but you get what I'm saying.
Yeah.
If your game is fun and if your game has a strong vision, it will find a market. It may not be a huge market. It might be 50 really passionate people. It might be 5,000 really passionate people, but you don't know until you put it out there. I genuinely thought a game of D&D with dogs was going to get 100 people, and I would have a fun time making that game and move on to my actual serious games that I will make real games now. And here I am 5 years later, still making this game about dogs because it really tapped into a market that I didn't know existed. And as with, things are happening in the world, things get worse and worse and worse. A game that can be, on one hand, cozy, and on the other hand, address some of the social problems in our world is something that finds a bigger and bigger audience each time. That wasn't an audience I could have anticipated in 2016, right? So a lot of the games that we think of as being really, really successful probably had no clue that they're going to be successful. Like we talked about Gloomhaven earlier. It's like Gloomhaven on paper should have been it was a massive risk and probably should have failed. It is a dense, complicated game. It costs $200 and with
21 pounds.
Right. So it's going to be a huge shipping cost, and You know, it plays forever, and there's lots of reasons why people could have easily said this game's not going to go anywhere, and it didn't. Because they were really behind it. They really took their time. They made sure that the game was the best game they could possibly make, and they put it out there, and it found an audience. So if the idea is let me say this. I feel like the idea is the least important part of game design. Execution is always way more important. So whether your idea is for the market is completely irrelevant. Is your game good for the market? And that's only if you make a good one.
Mm-hmm. Very good point. Anybody else want to take a stab at that one from Tanel, who asks, how do you know if your game idea is good enough for the market?
Yeah, for me, I wrote an article a couple years ago about this that got some fire from other people about this. But my thinking about if your game is good enough for the market, the way you know is if somebody wants to publish it. And if nobody wants to publish it, your game's not good enough for the market. Now, there are those like flukes where, you know, somebody self-publishes and it's this, you know, huge hit. But I think publishers are really good at knowing what audiences want, and designers are really good at knowing what they want to design. And sometimes those two things line up really nicely. And, you know, like Eddie was saying, like sometimes they line up in unexpected ways. When John and I did Kids on Bikes, we expected we were going to self-publish and sell, you know, we're like, maybe we'll hit like 10K on Kickstarter, maybe. And like our friends will write some stuff and like they'll bring some people in. And then Hunters was interested, and then they brought other people in, and it shocked us. So I think the way you know if it's good enough, if there's a market for it, is if publishers think there's a market for it. You don't have to, the good news is as a designer, you don't have to know that yourself if you don't want to.
Yeah. And it's interesting that you bring up a lot of good points. Like Kingdom Death Monster and Gloomhaven. And it's not that they're necessarily bad games that they had to be self-published. It's that publishers don't want to assume that risk of making that game that costs $250 odd. Some of those models in Gloomhaven, oh, sorry, not Gloomhaven, but in Kingdom Death, they're like that much just for the model, right? And so what publisher in their right mind is going to risk that on some idea that's not theirs? It's really a big risk for them to assume when they could get us a much more easy sell that's going to hit the market. And so, but with big risk, there's big rewards. So that's what we saw in games like KDM and Gloomhaven. For me, I know when it's ready to pitch to a publisher is when other people are talking about it without me asking them to, right? When people are talking about the game, like, hey, that game we played last week, have you made changes? Because I'm really interested in that. Or when they email me the next day, like I have friends who will email me the next day because I've solved that problem we were talking about last night. It's go, okay, so it interrupted your sleep. That's a good game to me. That's a game that's ready to pitch to somebody in some way, shape, or form. So I don't know. Honestly, I'm a game whisperer. Like I let the game tell me when it's ready to go. I don't say this game is ready to ship it. It's done. No, I let the game and people who play the game tell me how that's going to go. So some games, like I'm looking at the games on my shelves, I have a shelf behind me of all the games that have not whispered that to me yet. And that's just time. Yeah, Luke, do you have a point?
I would just say that the idea that publishers know is what makes a successful publisher, right? Because they pick the games that work. And it's not, I don't want you to think that what you're saying is it's the 3 people at AEG who first saw your game, right? The people at AEG who have connections with the distributors and the retailers and our international partners, all of them know how that, what we call the channel, what kind of games are doing well. And we all know what's coming out in the next 18 months from everybody, basically. So we sort of know what's going on. The big risk games you're talking about, like the Gloomhavens and there's certain games that will only do well on Kickstarter. And if you can build an audience of 10,000 people who know about your game, that can be successful, which is what Isaac did. But Kickstarter is not a place where you put a game out and 10,000 people find you most of the time. Most big games on Kickstarter, you find the 10,000 people first, and then you launch and they back it in the first 45 minutes. When you see a game backed in 45 minutes, that's marketing that happened before that game ever showed up on Kickstarter.
Yeah, you literally sold them the game before the Kickstarter launched.
Yeah.
And there's ways Kickstarter builds all these tools now for you to do that, right? With like early launch pages and stuff like that. So
yeah, and when I was first asked to redesign Balkan, that game actually came out once and failed in Japan. Yep. And Spin Master, the toy company, asked me to take a look at it, and I wasn't sure if I wanted to make this move from like the core hobby industry I love to, you know, doing a game for 8 to 10-year-olds. And I took a few Bakugan to Gen Con, and I left them on a table during a industry party where everybody was drinking, and I noticed that my friends couldn't put them down, and I'm like, okay, I'm making this game. Like, and this wasn't even a game for them. It was a game for 10 to 12-year-olds. But the way they just wanted to handle them all the time, I'm like, yeah, I need to be on this game. But I wasn't confident in that one, so I didn't know that industry. I didn't know the 20-year-old industry.
And it's got, that's almost like the meta of Magic the Gathering, right? That's the meta that actually catches a lot of people's interest in that game. Yeah. Cynthia, do you want to end it and let us know what you think? How do you know when your games are good enough to go to market?
Sometimes it's a very, excuse me, a very unscientific way in its gut feeling. And again, you have to actually do some legwork. Excuse me. Sorry, I have a sore throat. You got to go with your gut feeling. In most of my games, that's how it's done. And at the very least, my games have sold moderately well to higher than that. I've never had any like major flops. But a lot of what I do is I look for what's being talked about. But in the initial stages, because like Eddie said, if you wait for something to be hot, then you're too late. However, if you see the seeds of things and you know how to identify those, they can be a very good indicator as to what's going to be big, not what's big now. And if you, and sometimes it is honestly just luck. When I first came up with the idea for Urban Manhunt, honestly, I did not think that there was, I thought maybe, hey, cool, because I just wanted to do a miniatures game, because miniatures gaming is my favorite kind of gaming. And I thought, okay, well, what would that work? Well, so I looked at the different factors. One is it's easy to solo play. It's easy to also have multiple players. And so I look at those, and those are things that I've seen people wanting more. Like miniatures games traditionally, I mean, there are a lot of exceptions, but traditionally are one player versus one player as the standard. This is up to 4 standard. And so I didn't know for sure if it was going to fly or not. And it did. I mean, it's not like a gigantic, we're not talking Games Workshop numbers or anything like that, but it has at least got people interested that there's going to be a movie made of it. But it was a crapshoot on that one. I had a gut feeling that maybe something along the lines of The Running Man, Escape from New York, and The Warriors crammed together would maybe sell. And I went with that. So there is something to be said for gut feeling as long as you kind of look and see what's being talked about.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, thank you, everybody, for coming. Panelists, attendees, it was wonderful talking to you all. And, I hope that we see you again in like the real world. That'd be nice. So thank you, everybody, for joining. Thank you to people who asked questions, and thank to Save Against Fear for hosting this for us. So we're going to end the panel now. And
thank you for
moderating,
Sen.
Oh,
yes,
anytime.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Anytime. All right. So I think I have to stop this because it's recording, and then we will say goodbye to everybody. So I'm going to stop.